Welcome to the Darkstream, VoxDay, voxday.net, and unauthorized.tv. I'm told the audio and video are good. The live chat is up. Unauthorized chat is rolling, and super chats are active. So good evening. It's been an interesting couple of days. Just on the business front, we've successfully addressed the issues with the payment processor that we had. It's just a bureaucratic issue. However, it was a holiday here today, so they haven't turned it back on yet. We expect it'll be on hopefully before too late tomorrow. So it's a petty annoyance, but it's not an actual issue. All the other payment forms are going through just fine. So I will keep everybody posted when it is working. So let's see what else is going on that front. Not too much else to report. We're about to submit both the paperback and hardcover Golden Ages. So those who have purchased those should be getting them soon. And we just got a bunch more stuff in the pipeline that we're working on, and a very cool Archaven project. I think we're gonna have an interesting team up that is going to be of tremendous interest to a number of folks in 6 months or so. So we'll keep you posted on those. But I'm here to talk about an interesting development in the way that Clown World is approaching the Ukraine project. And, I pay a lot of attention to Clown World's intellectuals. I pay a lot more attention to them than I pay to the political leaders, the spokesmen, etc., because in general, in my opinion, what people like Paul Wolfowitz and Henry Kissinger and Robert Kagan and what they say is a much better predictor of what's important than whatever the politicians are babbling about at the time. The politicians are always talking about stuff that the intellectuals are talking about 3 to 5 years, or 3 to 10 years previously. And so it's been really interesting to work through Robert Kagan's books backwards and to see the way that their vision of the possible has continually gotten more and more restricted. First it was history's inevitable. We're inevitably going to win the entire world. This is the final end stage of all government. And then the dawning realization that Fukuyama was wrong. History has not ended. But they're going to have to, really garden the rest of the world, fix the rest of the world. And then they, started realizing about 2018 that wasn't going to work. And I have no doubt that that's part of why we saw the whole COVID thing, the vaccination thing, the shutdowns, etc., because it was an attempt to force the gardening of the jungle. And it was partially successful, obviously. I think it was probably more successful than some of them believed it could be. But like everything else on this world, the ability to maintain a state is limited. And so, I was just mowing the lawn today, and no matter how carefully you mow it, no matter how short you set the blades and that sort of thing, in 2 to 3 weeks, it's going to look like you never did anything at all. That's how the world works. And it's kind of funny because it's easy sometimes to understand the temptation to just say, screw it. What's the point? It's all going to revert back to uh, the previous state anyhow. But to me, that's the real white man's burden. It's the ability and the determination to carve out a little piece of civilization for however long it lasts. I always thought it was when we were in Boy Scouts, wandering around the woods, it was always kind of haunting to run into these abandoned houses. You'd find these old Sears catalogs dating back to 1920 or something, and you'd wonder, what happened to the people? How long you could tell how long it took for the house to deteriorate, and it was usually pretty easy to see that it wasn't going to last. The structure wasn't going to last another 20 years. Trees growing up through the floor, all that kind of stuff. But then you look at these old buildings over in Europe. You see these buildings that were first constructed in the year 1100 or something, and then gradually expanded and grew. And it's really impressive, the Spanish macias, because the Spanish just kind of keep adding on. Like, oh, we got 2 more kids that need rooms. Just add on 2 more rooms on the West End. They're just crazy. Some of these older ones. There's one fantastic place owned by a friend of a friend, and he's really decked it up. But it's crazy because you're wandering all through the place, and it feels like there's no rhyme or reason because there isn't. So, I think that what we see in Clown World is a perversion of that instinct. It's an attempt to impose a evil and unnatural order on societies and on people. And there's a clear willingness to violently attack and kill the people who don't go along with it, the people who will not be gardened. So, the Idaho Crusader says, to the current leaders, the jungle is what we see as true civilization. Well, it's part of it. Definitely part of it. But it's also what we don't see as civilization. It's, they have this satanic order, and it doesn't matter whether it's barbarism or whether it's the peak of European Christian civilization. All of it is unacceptable to them. All of it is to be gardened. But that's not going very well. And it was really fascinating to see the way in which Henry Kissinger made a complete 180. And let's take a look at. I've got the words, I think, on the blog. We can see exactly what he said. So, former U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger has signaled a U-turn in his views on Ukraine's prospective NATO membership. The veteran politician told The Economist that he now believes peace in Europe cannot be achieved without Ukraine joining the U.S.-led military bloc. Now, that's nonsense, of course, because it was the threat of Ukraine joining NATO that ended the peace, right? Last fall, Kissinger insisted it was not a wise American policy to attempt to include Ukraine into NATO. That's true. He said the bloc's eastward expansion since the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991 had essentially removed Russia's historic safety belt, but insisted that was no justification for Russia's surprise attack on Ukraine. Well, that wasn't the justification. The justification, of course, was the Kiev regime waging a vicious anti-Russian war on the occupied republics. However, in his interview on Wednesday with the British outlet, the politician, he's not a politician, but anyhow, who turns 100 on May 27th, suggested that for the safety of Europe, it's better to have Ukraine in NATO. He acknowledged that he currently finds himself in the weird position that people say, look at him, he's changed his mind. Now he's for the membership of Ukraine in NATO. Well, yeah, that's exactly what you did. The reason for such shift is twofold, Kissinger said. One, Russia is no longer the conventional threat it used to be. And secondly, we've now armed Ukraine to a point where it will be the best armed, most modern country and with the least experienced leadership in Europe. And, I mean, this is a really odd thing to say. Both of those things are very odd things to say, as is the switch. Ides of Apocalypse sends a super chat. He says, Kissinger has come a long way from running captured German towns in World War II as an army private. Yes, indeed. So, first of all, he said Russia is not a conventional threat. So what does that mean? Does it mean that they're militarily incapable? No. But what I think that he is saying is being more realistic about what Russia's goals are. You know, the whole purpose of NATO from the beginning was to keep the Russians from conquering all of Western Europe. That was the primary goal. Okay. Or as some wag once put it, keep the Russians out, keep the French in, and keep the Germans down. And so, by saying that Russia is not a conventional threat, Kissinger is signaling that Clown World understands that Russia doesn't want to take over all of Europe. You know, the whole narrative about Russia wants to take over all of Europe and China wants to take over the world, those narratives are entirely false. China does want to improve its position in the South China Sea and make its dominance there accepted by all. They want to make it clear that the South China Sea is a Chinese lake, more or less. Now, I don't believe they have any designs on, Korea or the Philippines or Japan or anything like that, and very few analysts actually do. It's kind of funny because they just start talking. They just start talking about how China wants to invade the world. But when you ask them, well, where do you think they're going to invade first? Korea, Japan, the Philippines? Well, they're secretly invading the USA. They're really not. I have no doubt that they have, tens of thousands of agents and military personnel present in the States, because the States have actively and openly said that they're the enemy, that they're going to, blow up the Chinese semiconductor industry rather than let Taiwan join, reunify with the mainland and so forth. But Sam is right, it's just projection. Americans find it very, very, very difficult to imagine that everybody doesn't want to be an American. And because America has been an imperial power for over 100 years, the imperialists in the United States find it very difficult to imagine that other people don't all want to be imperialists just like them, to be in their position. You know, I'm sure there are eventually going to be foolish leaders in Russia, in China, who will think that, you know, empire is a good idea. It's not. It's a terrible idea. Look at what has happened to the empire on which the sun never set. You know, it's now being ruled over by, you know, Indians and Muslims and Pakistanis. It's now being ruled over by the people they used to rule. And that's very common with empires. Very common. Idaho says, conservatives are obsessed with the idea of China invading America. It's how they avoid addressing who their real enemy is. Well, I think that that's partially true. I mean, I think that that's what the media conservatives do. You know, they love to complain again about China because it allows them to avoid the uncomfortable need to address the fact that the Jewish people have essentially taken over the U.S. government. You know, there's a picture the other day, proudly showing all of the Jews in the Biden administration. I mean, it's at the point now that, based on the usual description of anti-Semitism, any criticism of Joe Biden or his administration could be considered anti-Semitic. It's crazy. Sam wonders where the next seat of the empire will be. Well, it was supposed to be Ukraine. I mean, first it was supposed to be China. That didn't work out. You know, the Greater Israel program didn't really work out. So then Ukraine became the next obvious candidate. And that does not appear to be going very well. And so, what Putin almost certainly means when he talks about the need to denazify Ukraine, Europe, and the world, he's almost certainly talking about Clown World. It's a bit absurd that for some reason people who understand perfectly well that the left refers to people as Nazis who have nothing to do with the German National Socialist Workers' Party or its tenets. That they understand that those people are not using it in a dialectically correct historical context. Well, neither do the Russians. To the Russians, a Nazi is pretty much anybody who wants to invade Russia. And anyone who wants to destroy Russia. And Clown World has had its sights on Russia for the last 30 years. So, anyhow, the fact that what was the second thing that Kissinger said? I need to check that out again. So we addressed the first thing. The second thing he said was we have now armed Ukraine to a point where it will be the best armed, most modern country and with the least experienced leadership in Europe. So what he's saying is Ukraine and NATO are the army in Europe. All of the other armies in Europe are very small, very poorly equipped. They've sent most of what little gear they had to Ukraine. So Ukraine, the rest of Europe essentially doesn't have an army now. Their army is in Ukraine, and it's a NATO army. And so I think that what Kissinger is doing is recognizing the reality there and saying, how can Ukraine not be in NATO when Ukraine essentially is NATO at this point? But, I don't think that the Russians are going to fall for any of this. I don't think that the Russians are interested in any of this. That's the other thing that you always have to keep in mind about Clown World is Clown World always assumes the win. Clown World always talks as if their success is guaranteed. Id Prism says, least experienced leadership equals in need of a gardener. Exactly. They don't have very experienced leadership, so we have to provide it to them. Which is absurd anyhow, because the quote-unquote leadership there already reports to the U.S. neoclones. Zelensky is not calling any shots at all. Ladumba says, I thought the denazification of Ukraine is related to the Azov battalion. They wear neo-Nazi symbols like the Black Sun. No, that's the point that I'm making. The Azov battalion is irrelevant. I mean, they're not in the rest of Europe. They're not in the rest of the world. It's not even possible. Glass Darkly sends a super chat, thank you, and says, any specific site article that outlines Castelia's dedication to publishing original texts? Not that we've, I don't think that we've ever specifically articulated that sort of thing. I mean, we are dedicated to publishing original texts. We're literally working on that right now, with everything from obscure ancient military strategic works to John C. Wright novels and the 1894 Peacock edition of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. Sam Freeman sends a super chat, says, after Taiwan, does China have designs on other territory? I think that they want control of the two island chains. I think it's the Sakhalin Islands that are in a dispute with Russia, and then there's some islands that they're in a dispute with Japan as well. And so I think that it's all the islands that they're all after are all in places that will allow them to control the South China Sea. They don't want to permit U.S. warships to travel through there anymore. And so that's the goal. But, the main thing, obviously, is Taiwan Island. They want reunification. A lot of the Taiwanese want reunification. And as China continues to succeed, and as the West continues to descend into madness, that option is going to look more and more appealing to the people on the island. Glass Darkly says, that is what a number of my friends are looking for, but I have nowhere to send them for now. Well, why don't you email me some suggestions about things that you think would be useful for us to to say and to talk about, or to point out, and we can put something up on the Castalia House site and on the Castalia Library site. You know, we're happy to do it, happy to articulate it. But it seems to me that you've got some specific things in mind, and so run them by us. If it's something that we agree with, if it's something that we plan to do, if we're something that we're committing to do anyhow, I have no problem articulating it and putting it out there for people to refer to. It's a good idea. It was interesting to contrast and compare the way that the Taiwanese government just imposed a very unpopular pro-LGBT policy that was pushed through. It wasn't voted for in a referendum. It was forced through by the Supreme Court, and at the same time, the Chinese have been cracking down on some of that evil nonsense, and they've announced that they are launching projects to encourage young people to get married and have children. That's how you can see whether a society wants to live or not. A society that wants to survive and thrive is encouraging young women to get married, to have children, encouraging men to work hard and support them. Hungary is doing some wise things in that regard. China's beginning to. I think Russia is doing that as well. Those are signs of a healthy society. The West, most of the countries in the West are sick and degenerate societies. Everything from the rampant homosexuality to the immigration to the debt, these are all things that are indicative of degeneracy and decay. Yes, Taiwan's leader is a woman. Surprise, surprise. With massive numbers of invaders making their way into the U.S., it seems the global American empire has decided to ensure that the collapse is as bloody as possible. Yeah, it does look that way. Both the government as well as the ruling foreign elite have known that they're outnumbered by Americans for decades. But if they can import tens of millions of foreigners, at least they can muddy the waters and make it much basically put Americans on the defensive. I think that that's the goal. Vox, what are hard assets? Hard assets are things like gold, jewels, property. It's assets that are it basically means physical assets. Soft assets are cash, investments, bank deposits, stuff that you can't hold in your hand. Do you think NC won this week? I don't know what NC means. North Carolina? I don't have an opinion on that. With Fox on the decline, hopefully boomers pull their heads out of their asses and support the youth. Yeah, I wouldn't count on it. People don't really change very much once they hit about 30 or so. And in my experience, you're mostly going to see people doubling, tripling, and quadrupling down on the positions that they've held in order to justify their previous attitudes. You know, it's really interesting to see how people will waste incredible amounts of time trying to justify and defend and rationalize their previous position rather than simply analyzing, taking the new information into account and reaching a new conclusion. It's a complete waste of time. Yeah. I mean, I do it too, but I really do tend to find it frustrating when someone will say, well, isn't it this wrong thing that is wrong? And I say, no, that's wrong. This is right. And most people will then say, oh, well, I thought the wrong thing was wrong. I thought the wrong thing was right. And you're like, yes, I know. That's why I corrected you. That's why I disagreed with you and corrected you. You didn't need to tell me what you thought or why you thought it. It's wrong. And so I think that you're much more likely. I think that a lot of boomers are dismayed. I think a lot of them are deeply concerned. But I don't think that they have, I don't think most of them, some of them do obviously. But I think on average, it's easier for them to retreat into their elderly white enclaves and just not leave and essentially try to live as if it's still 1950. I mean, they already do that anyhow. So I just don't see them significantly adjusting their thinking in any great regard. Powers that bear. Somehow still shocked when you speak negatively about boomers. I don't know why. I was anti-boomer long before the millennials were. Mickey W says, I hate all the vibrants taking over, but I'm not going to go out and shoot anyone. How does it stop? Well, it doesn't. It doesn't stop until the shooting starts. They're already, for example, in Britain, there's a new TikTok thing that was going around apparently, and these Africans were just going into people's houses, and they weren't actually stealing anything. They were just going in and demonstrating that the homeowner wasn't going to do anything to kick him out. And they're like putting their feet up on the table and it was just basically a power play. And these British men did nothing. And so my expectation is that the global collapse will take place, and that will then lead to the atomization, the failure and the breakdown of the atomization of local communities, and that's when you're going to start seeing the old pattern. That's when you're going to start seeing the separation that we're now seeing in South Africa, that in the 50s was seen in India and Pakistan. The world that we've been living in for the past 60 to 100 years is very unusual. All of this, mixed people, diverse people living in neighborhoods divided up by house is not normal, and it's not going to last. Um, would you leave Canada if you lived in Canada? No, I wouldn't, because you want to be around people who are similar to you. Now you depending on where you are in Canada. I mean, I would leave Toronto. I would leave Vancouver. I would leave places that uh, the normal Canadians are not going to be able to hang on to. But where are you going to go? You can't speak Hungarian. Another super chat here from Ides of Apocalypse. He says Kissinger saying inexperienced officer corps is another reason for Ukraine needing NATO. No, he's actually talking about the political leadership. You know, the puppets that are currently uh, viewed as the leaders of Ukraine have no government experience. They don't know what they're doing, and they're not doing it well. So he wants Ukraine in NATO so that they, whoever is in their leadership position, can be officially told what to do. Sam Freeman sends a super chat saying, saw the same videos in Ireland. Migrants in groups waving big knives in public. Yeah. You know, it's all a power move. It's all a it's all meant to intimidate and prevent people from being willing to take action. And that's why the nations were demoralized. That's why all the stuff about, we're all the same and equal and together and blah blah blah. All of that was designed to weaken the population and render it unable to defend themselves. And so that's that's what's going on. That's why people are so in despair. What's crazy is that you look at all the people killing themselves by taking drugs and that sort of stuff. Like, instead of doing something useful and defending their nations and defending their people, they sit around, take drugs, and overdose. It's a little bit ironic that most people don't do anything because they're afraid of losing, losing their stuff, losing their lives, etc., etc. And so a significant percentage of them just go off and die. Fire up the fentanyl and OD. It's crazy. And so, but it's the whole thing is going to collapse, and you can see that we're rapidly approaching that point. Is it going to be this year that the U.S. political structure collapses? It's hard to imagine this year. It's not too hard to imagine it happening next year. I mean, for all intents and purposes, the U.S. is no longer a democracy. It's no longer a representative democracy. It's no longer a republic. It's just oligarchy, debt and oligarchy. I haven't found the quote. I think Michael Hudson was saying something about Aristotle, pointing out that democracy always leads to debt, which leads to a small group of people acquiring all the power and establishing an oligarchy, and then an aristocracy in order to stay in power. I don't know how accurate that is. I'd like to actually see the quote. But the time is rapidly approaching when all the Dan Bonginos who say it's really bad out there, but don't do anything. That's not. I don't see that happening much longer. You know, Sooner or later, you know the wrong daughter is going to get raped. The wrong family is going to get attacked. Um, and no doubt, the Fed and all the various three-letter agencies are all over all of those things trying to prevent it. But um, war is part of the human norm. It's a terrible and horrible thing, but it's not the only terrible and horrible thing. Um, Eyes of Apocalypse sends another super chat. Says, "Who knows what the clown brings in 2024? Fetterman AOC Democratic ticket." That would be funny. No, I think it's pretty obvious that Gavin Newsom is going to be involved somehow. It wouldn't be surprising at all if uh, they got rid of the Biden puppet. Um, although the advantage of the incumbent is significant, if you're going to fake it anyhow, I mean, I don't think anyone's going to believe Biden is credible. So if they're going to fake it, they're going to need something else. I think that Powers That Bear is probably correct. He says, "I'm sure France will provide the revolution clue." France is already in a quasi-revolutionary mode. It's still focused on Macron, and it's still focused on you know the side issues, but you know everybody knows what the real issues are, and um, we're already seeing the behavior of the clowns change. You know, the Jews have gone from bragging about how successful they are to telling people that mentioning somebody's ethnicity on Wikipedia is anti-Semitic, right? Uh, that's not a indicator of confidence. Um, when you've got Kissinger spinning his narrative at this point, it means that they're all in on Ukraine, and they have to be all in on Ukraine. They can't afford to lose Ukraine, but they're going to. How far reaching the consequences will be, I don't know. Nobody knows. But every day we see the clown world lies exposed. I mean, just today or last night, um, the Russians demonstrated that the very best U.S. anti-missile system can't even defend itself. Yeah. What do you think of Ireland? Well, uh, I think Ireland wasted a huge opportunity to get out